Paul's letter to the Romans. Check out the first video where we explored who Paul was and why he wrote this letter, and where we traced the core ideas through chapters 1 through 4. That humans are an amazing but hopelessly screwed up and sinful mess, and so need to be saved by God's grace. That people are saved by trusting in what Jesus the Messiah did for them, and not simply by trying to obey the laws in the Torah. And that God's purpose all along was to have a multi-ethnic family of Abraham that's spreading throughout the whole world. So in the remaining 3 sections of the letter, he's going to develop a whole bunch of ideas that he's planted here in the beginning, but now draw out their implications. In chapter 5, Paul begins by saying that when people trust in Jesus' death and resurrection for them, they are justified through faith, by which he means to be forgiven and put into a right relationship with God, and also given a place within God's family. Now he wants to show how that truth should reshape every part of their lives, because God is not only making a new family for Abraham, he's making new kinds of humans, a whole new humanity in Jesus. And this is why Paul goes back to the first human character in the biblical story, Adam, whose name means humanity. Paul says Adam and all humanity after him have chosen sin and autonomy from God, and so now they face God's judgment, they've become slaves to sin's influence, and it's all resulted in death. He then contrasts Adam with Jesus, who Paul says is a new Adam, a human who perfectly obeyed God in an act of sacrificial love, and who now offers his life as a gift to others, so that they can be justified before God. And so Jesus stands as the head of a whole new humanity that's being transformed by his love and his gift. Which leads Paul to chapter 6. Paul reminds these Christians in Rome that when they chose to follow Jesus, they made a choice to leave the old Adam-like humanity and to enter into the new Jesus humanity. And he highlights their baptism as a sacred symbol of that transition. Their old humanity has died with Jesus, and their new humanity was raised with Jesus. And so now our lives are joined to Jesus' life. What's true of him is now true of us. It's when we accept our identity as new Jesus-like humans, we're liberated to become what we were always made to be, wholehearted people who love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. Now, if creating this new humanity was always God's purpose, Paul asks in chapter 7 a question. What was the whole point of God giving Israel the law, or in Hebrew, the Torah? Now, side note, when Paul uses the word law, sometimes he means the storyline that unifies the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. But other times he's more specific. He's referring to the 613 commands given through Moses to Israel at Mount Sinai. The second meaning is Paul's focus here. What was the purpose of all of those commands then? Chapter 7 is Paul's answer. The commands of the Torah are good, Paul says. They showed God's will for how Israel should live. But if you go read the biblical story, Israel broke all of the commands. The more laws they received, the more they replayed the sin of Adam and rebelled. And so here's the point. Even when God gave his own people specific moral rules to obey, that didn't fix the problem of the sinful human heart. In fact, paradoxically, those laws that are good made us more guilty. But, Paul says, that paradox is the point. God's goal was to make it crystal clear that it's evil and sin that have hijacked the human heart, and the Torah, as good as it is, can't do a thing about it. But, Paul says as he moves into chapter 8, the answer to the problem has arrived in Jesus and in the work of his Spirit to create new Jesus-like humans. Here's how. He says the commands were like this magnifying glass that exposed and focused the problem of sin into one place on the people of Israel. But now Israel has a representative, their Messiah, Jesus. And where Israel failed, Jesus paid for and dealt with all of that sin in his death and his resurrection. And now Jesus has released his Spirit into his new family, which gets to the heart of chapter 8. He says Jesus' Spirit is now changing the hearts of his own people so that they can truly live out the core commands of the Torah, to love God and to love their neighbor as themselves. And not only that, God's renewal of humans is just one part of his larger mission to rescue and restore the whole universe. God's purpose is a renewed creation where his love gets the final beautiful word. That's the flow of thought in chapters 5 through 8, and it raises a question. If all of this was God's purpose, then what now about Paul's fellow Israelites who don't acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah? That's what he explores in chapters 9 through 11. He begins in chapter 9 with his own anguish over Israelites who don't recognize Jesus as their Messiah. But he also reminds us that this rejection is not a surprise to God, and so he retells the whole story of Israel in really condensed form to make 2 points. First, he shows how God has always been graciously selecting a subset of Abraham's descendants to be the line of promise. And Paul's implying that now the line of promise is carried on by those Israelites that accept Jesus as their Messiah. Second, he also reminds us that this is not the first time that people have rejected God's will. He brings up the story of Israel and the golden calf. He brings up Pharaoh's rebellion to remind us that God was able to bring good out of people's rejection for his own redemptive purposes. So in chapter 10, he explores why so many Israelites have rejected Jesus. He says they've become so focused on their observance of the commands in the Torah as the basis of their relationship with God that they didn't recognize what God was doing for them through Jesus, their own Messiah. So Paul asks in chapter 11, is God done with ethnic Israel? No, Paul says, definitely not. I'm an Israelite. And there are plenty of other Jews who have recognized Jesus as their Messiah. But Paul says there are a lot who don't. But their rejection is having a paradoxical effect for good. Paul sees that it's resulted in the message of Jesus spreading out into the non-Jewish world, making the family of Abraham even larger and more multi-ethnic. He describes the family as this big olive tree, and he says non-Jewish Christians are like these wild branches that have gotten grafted into the family tree. However, Paul says, one day, this rejection will all be reversed. When Jesus returns, he will be acknowledged by his own people. Paul doesn't offer any details about how. He simply trusts God's character and promise that he will not give up on his original covenant people. Which transitions then into the final section of the book, chapters 12 through 16, which is Paul's challenge to this divided church in Rome. And so think about the big picture. In light of the good news about Jesus and Abraham's family, in light of the fact that there are new humans in Jesus, in light of the fact that God has been faithful to his covenant promises to Israel, so now Jesus' multi-ethnic family needs to be unified in peace and love and forgiveness. In chapters 12 through 13, he explores what that unity looks like. It looks like everybody using their own unique passions and gifts and talents to serve each other and look out for one another's well-being. Then he focuses on how they are to be a community of peace. You have Jewish and non-Jewish Christians who need to learn how to forgive each other and not cause problems in the church or for the local government. These Christians, Paul says, should have as their highest calling to love God and to love their neighbor as themselves, which fulfills all of the commands of the Torah. In chapters 14 through 15, he focuses specifically on the divisions in this church in Rome. So remember the disputes between the non-Jewish and Jewish Christians about the food laws and the Sabbath laws. Paul says that love, grace, forgiveness will heal those divisions. They are one family, unified in Jesus, all because of God's grace. And so they need to learn how to show that same grace to each other, even when they differ passionately on non-essential issues. Paul closes out this letter by greeting a whole bunch of people that he hasn't seen for a long time. And that's the letter to the Romans. Whoa. I hope this has helped you connect all of the pieces together. And so now you should go read it with some friends.